It's obvious, but it's also just fascinating that hardship is the thing that is that ends up being the catalyst for delving deeply.
It's hardship voluntarily undertaken. Well, and it's crucially true. Look, if you bring someone into therapy, let's say they're afraid of elevators, and you trick them into getting near an elevator, you'll make them worse. But if you negotiate with them so that they voluntarily move towards the elevator on their own recognizance, they'll overcome their fear and they become generally braver. But it has to be voluntary.
See, I got to push back and explore with you the question of voluntarily.
Yeah.
Let's look at Nietzsche.
Yeah.
He suffered through several health issues throughout his life. Migraines, eyesight issues, digestive problems, depression with suicidal thoughts. And yet he is one of the greatest minds in the history of humanity. So were these problems that he was suffering arguably involuntarily a feature or a bug?
That's a good question. The same thing happens in the story of Job, because Job is a good man. God himself admits it. And Satan comes along and says to God, I see you're pretty proud of your man there, Job. God says, yeah, he's doing pretty well. And Satan says, I think it's just because things are easy for him. Let me have a crack at him and see what happens. And God says, yeah, I think you're wrong. Do your worst. Right, and that's how people feel when those slings and arrows come at them, let's say like Nietzsche. Well, Job's response to that, now the story is set up so that what befalls Job is actually quite arbitrary, right? These catastrophes that you're describing. The voluntarism in Job is his refusal to despair even in the face of that adversity. And that seems like something like an expression of voluntary free will. He refuses to lose faith. And the way the story ends is that Job gets everything back and more. And, so that's a descent and ascent story. And a cynic might say, well, the ends don't justify the means. And I would say, fair enough, but that's a pretty shallow interpretation of the story. What it indicates instead is that if you're fortunate, because let's not forget that, and you optimize your attitude even in the face of adversity, that it's not infrequently the case that your fortunes will reverse. And I've found that in many situations, the journalists whose goal was most malicious in relationship to me, who were most concerned with improving their own, what would you say, fostering their own notoriety and gaining social status at my expense, were the ones who did me the greatest favor. Those were the interviews that went viral. And so that's interesting, because they were definitely the places where the most disaster was at hand. And I felt that in the aftermath. Every time that happened, my whole family was destabilized for like 2 months because it wasn't obvious at all which way the dice were going to roll.
But you leaned into that. So in a sense that there's this kind of a transformation from the involuntary to the voluntary. Basically saying, bring it on. That act of bring it on turns the involuntary hardship into voluntary hardship.
Well, not necessarily, let's say, but you could say that's your best bet. Well, I'm never going to say that you can transcend all catastrophe with the right attitude, because that's just too much to say. But I could say that in a dire situation, there's always an element of choice. And if you make the right choices, you improve you improve your chances of success to the maximal possible degree.
It might be too much to say, but nevertheless could be true. Viktor Frankl, Marcus Aurelius.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what the resurrection story proclaims, is that, even under the darkest imaginable circumstances, the fundamental finale is the victory of the good. And that seems to me to be true.